Okay, well, I guess we'll get going. It's a couple minutes after and people are still filing. Hey, my name is Mark Hedden. I am Executive Director of the Florida Keys Audubon Society. And this is, COVID's thrown a lot of us in a loop, but this is our first time we're going to try doing an online Zoom meeting. We've done, I think everybody's done kind of Zoom meetings where everybody talks. This is our first time doing a Zoom webinar where basically Steven and I will have control of the camera and the screen and we'll have an audience. So hopefully that'll work. If you have any questions, there's a little Q&A button down there where you can send us a question, and if we can, we'll try and answer it. So we'll get going there. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Whitfield. He's with Zoom Miami. His proper title is, I wrote it down, a conservation and research specialist. But to a lot of us, he's now known as the flamingo guy, whether he likes it or not. He started out as a herpetologist, I believe.
I still am.
Still is a herpetologist, very interested in frogs, but he's been foisted into the role of being a flamingo guy. So that's what we're going to talk about today is flamingos and the Florida Keys. Should they be here? What's their kind of historic occupation of the Keys? Occupation is maybe not the right word, but we'll go from there. So hey, Stephen, how you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
All right, so let's go with the most basic question. Should there be flamingos in the Keys?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's a couple different ways to look at this. Kind of one of them is, are they a natural part of the Keys ecosystem? And the answer to that, I think, is definitively yes. Ornithologists going back to Audubon himself saw flamingos in the Keys. Back in the 1830s, there's kind of a classic, his painting of American flamingos is from the Florida Keys, from birds that he actually saw there. And since Audubon, through the 1800s, naturalists knew that there were flocks of flamingos in Florida Key and Florida Bay, in the Florida Keys and Florida Bay. So clearly, when there were few people in South Florida, there were flamingos seen regularly in the area. So kind of the question of whether they naturally should be there, without a doubt, yes. There's a question of, why they're not there now. And in part, that's really a question of how we as people want to manage them. And collectively, that's through us as individuals, as well as wildlife biologists and governments who oversee wildlife. We do know, so while flamingos were in the Keys through the 1800s, we're all probably familiar with the story of plume hunting in South Florida. In the late 1800s, it became highly fashionable to have decorative feathers on women's hats. And plume hunters came down to South Florida where the birds were just crazy. And people hunted wading birds in the Everglades and in Florida Bay, and really drove the wading bird populations down really low. So egrets were targeted really heavily. And we're seeing, many species were driven nearly extinct in South Florida through this plume hunting. Reddish egrets were nearly wiped out. Spoonbill populations were very low, but the flamingos were entirely wiped out by the plume trade. And they've never really recovered since.
Okay, so let's basically let's talk a little bit about conky. I know it always keeps coming back to conky, but a couple years ago, there was a flamingo that showed up. They've been showing up intermittently over the years, and the belief was always that these, basically one of the old school ornithologists had sometimes said with great authority that any flamingo you see in Florida at this point is an escapee from Hialeah racetrack, and that was taken as gospel for decades, probably. And I guess the question is that true?
So that was really kind of the inception of our research project at Zoom Miami. The flock at Hialeah was established in the 1920s, and it's a large breeding flock of a few hundred individuals that's still around today, about 100 years later. And so when the wild flamingos were hunted out, but the Hialeah population, was growing, people just assumed that it makes more sense that a flamingo in Florida would be from Hialeah than would be from somewhere else around the Caribbean. So we were on the lookout for flamingos to equip them with satellite transmitters. The idea being, if we can put a tracker on a flamingo, then it will tell us where flamingos come and go to. So if we were tracking a flamingo and it went back to Hialeah and then left again, that would be a really good sign that, okay, these flamingos are one of Florida's many non-native species, escapes from captivity, like many other of the species we see around here. In contrast, if a flamingo flew to Mexico or Cuba or the Bahamas, it would be an indication that flamingos are, a natural part of the ecosystem, just like migratory birds come in and go all the time. There's breeding populations of flamingos around the Caribbean, and maybe a flamingo, comes in on its own, forages for a while, and then leaves.
So there was, I remember in late 90s probably was one of the first intimations that maybe these flamingos we were seeing aren't from Hialeah Racetrack. And do you remember that one? Was it a bird from Mexico or something like that?
Yeah, so there was a banded bird maybe in 2002. In Mexico, there's a big program where there's a breeding population of the Yucatan, and the biologists round up flamingo chicks each year and ban some of them. And so in 2002, I think a flamingo that was banded as a chick in Mexico was spotted in Florida. And then a few years later, a second one showed up. And in 2018, a third one did. So we've got at least 3 birds that are definitively wild. But that doesn't tell us that most of the birds are coming from Mexico. Most of them could be coming from Cuba or the Bahamas. Most of them don't have bands. Most of them could be coming from Hialeah. So we wanted to start tracking the flamingos and find out really where they're coming from.
Okay, and so that led to you guys were looking for a candidate basically to put a satellite tracker on, right? And the satellite tracker does what? It records how a bird moves around.
So it's like a GPS unit, except it communicates with the satellite. So the way satellite telemetry works, you put a device on a bird. They're either battery powered or solar powered. In our case, they were solar powered. And it collects GPS points every day. So just like if you had a handheld GPS unit, or your phone is tracking you all the time, this takes GPS points a few times a day, and then every few days it communicates those GPS points to a satellite, and we just download them. The satellite talks to the internet. We just download these locations. So it's a really useful technology for tracking wildlife. Because you can just let an animal go with a satellite tracker on it, and then you get a few points each day on where the animal is. This is a really foundational, a really important technology in wildlife biology.
Mm-hmm. And so you guys wanted to do this, and so you're looking for a candidate. And so what happened then?
So then we were notified by the Naval Air Station down in Key West, that a flamingo had showed up on ponds next to their runways and wouldn't leave. And normally, birds are bad for aircraft, and they have people who harass the birds to go away. But this flamingo, who we named Conky, just wouldn't leave. So they called us to see if we could capture the bird and help them remove it while also helping us with our research project. So we went down. This was Dr. Frank Ridgely, who heads up the conservation department at the zoo.
Mm-hmm.
He and I went down. We met up with Thomas Sweets at the Key West Wildlife Center. The Naval Air Station told us that we had a few days to capture the flamingo, but they couldn't just spend all of their time letting biologists run around interfering with flights taking off and leaving. So we had a limited window for when we could capture the flamingo, and if we weren't able to do it, they were gonna go another direction. So we spent a couple days with no success, and ultimately it was Thomas Sweets who was able to capture the flamingo. I've got a, if you want, I've got a photo of this. Can I screen share?
Yeah, if you hit the screen share button down below and it should bring it up. Can you see that?
Okay. Yes, give me 1 second.
Yeah, while he's doing that, I mean, I don't know if pretty much most people in Key West at least know Thomas Sweets because he's always running around rescuing birds.
Right.
Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so we've got some images.
All right.
Here.
So so you can see this. This is a video we took of Conky, our flamingo, out here. Here's Thomas right here on the edge, and the wind was blowing really hard. At first we tried, you can see we have a net rigged up there, and we were trying to kind of push Conky into this mist net. That wasn't working. Thomas suggested that we use a net gun. And so, net guns are basically, they're a setup where you can fire a net. It's based on compressed air, and it works at short range, but it's difficult when it's really windy like this. You also have to be really close to the flamingo. So we spent a lot of time with Thomas hiding out, and Frank and I tried to push Conky towards him without making the bird too scared so he would fly. And this took a while. It took quite a while. But this is an image.
I love this image. I'm sorry.
This is such a great image. So this is Thomas hiding in the grass just before he got the winning shot. Just before they were about to kick us off the base, because we were wasting too much of their time, we were able to get the flamingo in hand. One of the things that's really nice about working with a zoo is that you have a lot of equipment to work with different types of wildlife. So we just happen to have a flamingo crate, which we use for transporting flamingos around. This is Thomas Sweets and Frank Ridgely pulling the flamingo out of the net. We put him in the flamingo crate, and he stayed at the Key West Wildlife Center for a few days while we could convince to kind of come up with a plan for where to release Conky. When Conky first showed up at the base, there were 2 other flamingos with him, and they kind of departed, leaving him there alone. But shortly after that, on eBird, which is kind of our intel source for where flamingos are around Florida, 2 flamingos showed up at Snakebite. So we made the conclusion that these are probably the same 2 flamingos that were seen a few days earlier at the Naval Air Station, and we decided that we should let Conky go in Snakebite. If you're not familiar with Snakebite, it's kind of like the flamingo hotspot for Florida.
That's where I saw my first one.
It's directly west of the Flamingo Visitor Center in Everglades National Park. I think there were just 4 flamingos seen there this weekend. It is really kind of the hotspot for flamingos in Florida. So it made sense as a good place to release the flamingo. But it was difficult for us because when we we're trying to get our permits aligned so we could release the flamingo, and the state of Florida told us that we can't release flamingos because they're not native species.
This goes back to the whole Hialeah theory that any flamingo you see is an escapee from Hialeah, correct?
Exactly. And in defense of FWC, that's a great law. If people didn't release non-native species, we wouldn't have python problems. We wouldn't have iguana problems. Florida would be a lot more natural of a place. But we had to convince them that it was actually worth letting Conky go with a satellite transmitter. So ultimately, we were able to do that. We took him out to snake bite, and here's a couple images of him here. You can see he's got a color band on that says US 01. That's because he was the first flamingo banded in the United States. And then on his other leg, he's got his satellite transmitter. So this is a solar powered GPS unit we had programmed to collect 4 GPS points each day. And then the long antenna transmits to satellites where we can download the data.
And do these devices hurt the animals at all?
No, they don't. So this is specially set up for flamingos. They use this on the same style on cranes, and they've been using it for a long time. So we know that it won't hurt the bird.
Okay.
It's padded on the inside with neoprene, so it's well padded. And so we left Conky out in snakebite. You can see that he's kind of pale pink here, and he's got a bit of gray on the neck. This to us indicates that he's probably a young bird. And we had a genetic sex test done that indicated that he's male. So I'll refer to him as male because we know that's his sex. So he was probably a young male, maybe a couple years old, and we assume he was young enough that the 2 birds that flew in with him were his parents. So we left him out in snakebite, and then one morning, maybe 5 or 6 days after he was out in snakebite, we got a frantic call from staff at Everglades National Park at the Flamingo Visitor Center. And they had found him, maintenance staff had found him on the side of the road at the Flamingo Visitor Center. And he looked terrible. He was, just sitting down. That's not normal behavior for flamingos. So they rushed him to us at the zoo so we could, do some rehab work with him. It turned out he had a heavy infestation of liver flukes. And this we think is because he was foraging in the ponds at the Naval Air Station, where there are a lot of snails in the ponds, but probably not a lot of other food items. And snails are a host for flukes. Another nice thing about being based at the zoo is that we have a quarantine space. We have flamingo food. We have veterinarians who are knowledgeable about how to treat flamingos. So we kept Conky for a while until he was deemed in good health. This is a short video I have of our kind of daily care for Conky. Here he is this is in one of our behind the scenes quarantine pens at the zoo. We'd feed him flamingo chow. This looks just like cat food or dog food, but it's specifically formulated for flamingos. So every day we'd give him some flamingo chow, check on him, and we kept him there while he kind of regained his health, and we deemed him releasable. So when he was deemed releasable, we released him a second time. This is a little video of him. We took him out on a boat.
Would they let you release him in the park the second time?
You know, the park, they weren't too enthusiastic about us releasing Conky in the park again. The park gave us one shot. So the second time we released him, we just took him out to Florida Bay, pointed him near the park, and let him go. And there's some cool audio here of us wishing him well as we kind of let him go off the boat.
Good luck, buddy.
So we were optimistic that Conky would do better this time, and he made it 5 days the first time. He made it 22 months before his transmitter failed the second time. So we were very happy with how he did on his own. One of the things that was most exciting about Conky is that he kept showing up with other flamingos. So here's an image of him with 2 other flamingos in snake bite. This is in the summer of 2017. But our first observation of Conky with another flamingo was from just a couple months after release. And then pretty much every time we saw him or birders saw him and sent us photos, he was with other flamingos. So this was really interesting because he found other flamingos out in Florida Bay. And remember how our original idea was Conky was going to fly somewhere else. He was going to tell us where flamingos come from. Mm-hmm. In nearly 2 years, he never left Florida Bay. And the last, so this is from the summer of 2017, when he was kind of developing a cult following. People would post images from him in snake bite, and people wanted to go see flamingos. So we had really good information on what he was doing that summer. But if you remember, the summer of 2017 was Hurricane Irma.
I do remember that, yeah.
Yeah. While we in Miami were preoccupied with ourselves and impacts from Hurricane Irma, we were also deeply worried about Conky. So the satellite transmitters, they have a lifespan like most technology. And by the summer of 2017, our data we were getting from Conky was really spotty. Sometimes we would get good data, and sometimes we wouldn't get good data at all. There were a couple weeks where we had no data on Conky, and it was just observations like this where we could tell, where he was. Just after Hurricane Irma, it took us a few days before our first satellite signals came back. But when we did get them, it was really clear that he was moving around Florida Bay. Our last GPS coordinates from Conky were only a few days after Hurricane Irma, but he was moving between Snakebite and some of the keys in the middle of Florida Bay. So it's pretty clear that he survived that storm. And then the last possible observation we have of Conky is from November 2017. This image of 5 flamingos at Snakebite. And you can see, you can't really tell if this is Conky, but if you look right here at this, can you see my cursor here?
Yep.
If you look right here, there's what looks to be a kind of shiny or blue spot. And what we think is that that's Conky's satellite transmitter. I don't know why else there would be this kind of bluish silver shine. But this is what we think is the last, our last indication of where Conkey was. There's been no sign of him in Florida Bay ever since then. And so we don't know where he is.
So he could have flown off. I mean, it's probable the satellite tracker died. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it looks like this. So by this point, the satellite tracker was definitely dead. We know he survived Hurricane Irma, and we know that the satellite tracker was failing at that point.
Mm-hmm.
We think probably the best explanation is that if he met up with another group of flamingos and they took off, he probably went with them. So this was actually the last group of, more than a couple of flamingos that were seen in snakebite for a few months. So we assumed that those other flamingos left and that Conkey left with them.
Well, so do you know how long a flamingo lifespan is supposed to be in the wild? I'm just curious. I mean,
Yeah, the longevity record of flamingos in the wild is 50 years.
Wow.
So presumably, if Conkey's still out there, he could get sighted again anywhere. So that's pretty exciting.
That is pretty exciting. So, so we got Conkey, and so we've got like this one bird to it kind of attach. And I think one of the things I remember from talking about this previously is he was all over Florida Bay, but he was hardly ever spotted by people. Is that kind of what the takeaway was? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can show you a range map of where he was in Florida Bay. This is all of our satellite telemetry data from the 2-year period. So this big map here is Florida Bay itself. Here's US 1. There's the Flamingo Visitor Center. And each of these yellow points is a place where we got a GPS fix from Conkey. The yellow blobs are where he spent the majority of his time, and the orange spots are like primo Conkey areas. That's where he spent most of his time. And these, so this rectangle here is snake bite. Basically, the only places where Conkey was sighted by people were in snake bite. The other places that he hung out, these other 3 orange blobs, are places that look like this. So these are the keys in Florida Bay. And if you look at them, so there's 3 of them that he hung out in a lot, and they're all similar in a couple ways. They've got these shallow ponds in the middle of them. The salinity of these is really variable, but they're all ringed by mangroves. So first off, you can't get into these places because they're off limits to the public. But if you were cruising by on a boat, you would never be able to see inside to see where the flamingos are, to see where Conkey is. So these habitats are really kind of invisible spots for the flamingos. And it's really only snake bite where we would get any reports from them at all.
So basically the takeaway is we've got these 4-foot tall pink birds walking around, and they still manage to elude being seen by humans most of the time, which means.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. Right. It's crazy.
I always find that kind of hilarious because I think as bird watchers, we think we're pretty smart and we see everything, but obviously we do not. So that means we really don't know how many flamingos are probably moving around in South Florida right now. I mean, there was the area, what is STA3? Do you know much about that area?
Yeah, STA2, right?
STA2, sorry.
Up in Palm Beach, yeah.
And they're having up to what, 100 flamingos at a time in there?
So for quite a while, there were flamingos showing up in this same managed wetland every year. And more of them were showing up each year. One year, the record count was, I think, 147. So that's a lot of flamingos. And we tried capturing flamingos there as well, but we haven't been successful yet. We're still trying, but for the past couple of years, the flamingos haven't returned there, at least not to stick around. But even there, the Audubon of the Everglades, they run tours there when the flamingos show up, but most of the time that area is off limits to the public. So it's restricted access, and it's kind of the middle of nowhere. Just like these islands in Florida Bay are kind of the middle of nowhere. People may go by while fishing, but there's not a lot of people out there to look for flamingos.
Right. So I guess the question then is, so the bird was, it's not on what's called the official list of the state of the birds of Florida. It was considered extirpated, and then all the birds that they were seeing were considered to be exotics because they were allegedly wiped out, right? And go ahead.
So best I can summarize the population history, there used to be a resident population in Florida that were hunted out. Then people established captive colonies like the one at Hialeah. The state, I think, it's unclear what their policy on flamingos is right now, but for a long time, they certainly had them on the list of non-native species. They seem to have removed them, but most of the species of wading birds in Florida Bay were the object of intense conservation attention from the early 1900s.
It was actually the genesis of the Audubon Society.
It was exactly, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is one of our kind of earliest wildlife conservation laws, was largely driven by the loss of wading birds in the Everglades. And so it's really remarkable that so many bird species were protected, but flamingos were left off that list, despite the fact that they're really an iconic bird for South Florida.
So you're part of what you've been doing in the last couple of years is trying to get them back on the list, correct?
So we're trying to raise the conservation profile for flamingos. We would like to see a Florida Bay that is healthy enough for flamingos to return. The problem is that if the state considers them non-native, we can't take any conservation actions. So in 2018, we formally petitioned the state to add flamingos to the list of endangered species. And that's a slow and kind of complicated process, but the state has been moving forward with that request. And my understanding is that they're going to make some decision on it, possibly in May of this year.
Okay. And so there may be a public comment portion on that, right? On that process, is there a public comment? Do you know?
I believe so. I do not know if they would officially call it public comment.
Okay.
But certainly, I would encourage people to talk to their elected officials about any issue, especially those that pertain to wildlife. My understanding is that they will issue a decision in advance of their, the actual, the process, after we requested that the species be added to the list of endangered species in Florida, there's a long process that this has to go through. There are biologists at the state of Florida that have to review the information. They have a process of peer review where external biologists weigh in their input, but the people who actually make the decision are the commissioners at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So there's a handful of people who actually have to make that decision. They have input from their own biologists, from external biologists, but they're the ones who actually make the decision. And that happens in one of their regular year meetings each year. I think they have 6 or 7 meetings each year. And that would be the May date where that decision is made if it goes to the May meeting.
Okay.
But in advance of that, their biologists will issue a suggestion for what FWC should decide based on what we know about the biology of the flamingos.
Okay.
So if people do want to take action, that would be the time to contact the FWC commissioners.
Okay, can you tell me, I know you've done a little bit of what we call historical research, trying to kind of bolster the case of Florida's flamingos being natives in Florida. Can you talk about that a little bit? Some of the research you've done?
I absolutely love kind of biological history. And I mentioned, let's see if I've got this here. I mentioned Audubon himself painting flamingos. And while Audubon was, clearly a bird enthusiast, it was really common for naturalists like Audubon to kill the birds that they were looking for and preserve them as natural history specimens. Mm-hmm. And this seems barbaric to us now that that someone who's so enthusiastic about nature would use hunting as a method to collect a bird as beautiful as a flamingo, but it was really common at the time. And it's actually really important for us that they did collect specimens of flamingos, because museums still have some of these flamingos that were hunted by naturalists in the 1800s as physical evidence of flamingos being here. And it's really cool right now because, living in the information age, museums are getting organized and putting all of their collection information online. So it's really easy to do a search of all the museums in the US to see where flamingos were collected and when. And this is a timeline of flamingo specimen collection in South Florida. So these are specimens that still exist today. But you can see there's a lot of them through the 1800s. And in around the 1900s, they basically trail off. So there's lots of flamingos that were collected through the 1800s and very few in the 1900s, particularly in the later 1900s. And this really kind of confirms what we know about the population history of the flamingos. We also found, so these are just adult birds, basically taxidermied specimens. But another thing that we found, and this kind of blew my mind as I was looking into this, but there was this weird hobby of collecting bird eggs, which is called oology. And it was really popular in the late 1800s. And we were able to look not just at natural history museums for adult flamingos, but for egg specimens as well. And we found 4 different eggs or egg sets of flamingos that were allegedly collected in Florida Bay or the Florida Keys in the late 1800s. So this is really interesting because this suggests that not only were flamingos in Florida, but they were nesting here. Mm-hmm. And this to me seems really cool and is really important because it kind of creates a baseline for what the population was doing here before. There's certainly no evidence that flamingos have nested in Florida since the early 1900s, but this seems to be pretty decent evidence that they were nesting here before.
Okay, and so a little bit back to the specimens that you found. Is there anything you can tell about their origin from looking at the specimens?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways we can use these physical specimens as clues. Right now, we're working with collaborators at the University of Central Florida to extract DNA from these flamingo specimens. We wrote to the museums and they gave us small pieces of tissue from the flamingos. So we can use this to kind of understand the genetic relationships between Florida's flamingos and flamingos around the Caribbean. We can also use a test. We can also use a type of chemistry called stable isotope, basically stable isotope ecology.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a way to kind of understand differences in the environments where birds live. So we're all familiar with the radioactive elements that are part of the nuclear age, but there are stable isotopes of elements as well, and these differ in predictable ways, kind of around ecosystems. And biologists have been using these as kind of tracers of where animals kind of come and go to for a long time. So bird people use this a lot. If you collect a feather sample of a bird, you can tell based on the stable isotopes what kind of things it's eating, where it spent the summer or winter. And what we're finding with the flamingos is that there's really big differences between captive flamingos and wild flamingos. And so then when we take a feather from a bird like conky, we can ask whether its stable isotope profiles look more like captive or wild birds.
Okay.
So this is a way that we can really kind of use science to tell more about the origins of where the birds are coming from.
That's great. Yeah, just a basic question. The pink in flamingos, where does that come from in American flamingos?
Yeah, it's based on diet. So it's based on carotenoids and things that they eat. Famously shrimp, but lots of things that they eat contain these carotenoids. Lots of algae, lots of different invertebrates. So that's where their color comes from.
Okay. Because it is, I mean, flamingos have just one of the weirdest feeding systems I think ever. Is they basically invert their head, they keep it underwater, and then they pump water through with their tongues. They have these massively powerful tongues, correct?
Yeah, and they're basically filter feeders. Their bills are shaped basically kind of like a strainer, like a sieve, and they pump water through and collect plankton and things from the water. It's a very weird feeding system.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's strange. Very cool. But I mean, and it's. I'm trying to think. I might try and see if I can find a little bit of video. Just watching the way a flamingo's head moves, the whole architecture of that is just. It's almost unreal. But so what's the? I mean, we got a couple questions, and we'll take them in a minute. But what's the one thing you think people should know about flamingos, but they don't?
So lately I've been trying to think about, species in our environment and things that we share in common with them. And for flamingos, I think there's something that really unites their fate and ours here in South Florida. Living in Miami or living in the Keys, we're very close to sea level, and we're hugely impacted by sea level rise. So ultimately, our in a 100-year window, if we can't resolve sea level rise, our options are, we basically have to move. And flamingos, there's only a few places where they nest now around the Caribbean. And basically every place where they nest is at sea level. So just like us in South Florida, flamingos are really susceptible to sea level rise. And how we deal with that as people, is also going to impact how wildlife respond.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good thought. All right, so let's go to a couple of questions. There's a couple of questions about like why you generally see lone flamingos. I don't know. Is that something known to science, as opposed to,
So probably what we're seeing is a lot of individual flamingos. Some of them may be blown off course, or some of them may be scouting out new areas. We definitely see in South Florida individual flamingos or small groups. But for example, when they show up at STA2 in the big groups, they kind of tend to stream in a few at a time. It's not like there's 0 flamingos and then they all show up. And we do know from work that's been done with other species of flamingos, they are capable of traveling long distances for foraging or for looking for new nesting habitats. So it's probably either birds scouting out new environments, or in some cases, birds that are blown off course by storms.
Okay. This should be an easy one. Why don't the Hialeah flamingos leave?
Well, in part, it's because they've got a comfortable environment there, and the people at the racetrack feed them. They have food for them there. But they probably do leave occasionally. But I imagine that they tend to come back because they're used to being fed.
You don't think, are there wings clipped there at Hialeah?
When they first established the flock in the 1920s, they clipped the wings of the birds, but they don't anymore.
Okay.
And every once in a while, you see a flamingo. So the birds at Hialeah, the birds at Hialeah. So our birds at Zoo Miami and most zoos, we feed them a specially formulated diet that has carotenoids in them in the diet. So the birds turn pink. But in Hialeah, they have their own formula for the diet, which doesn't have that rich source of carotenoids. So the birds are pretty pale. But every once in a while, someone sees a pale bird around Florida, and it's never clear if it's an escape from Hialeah, or if it's a young bird that flew in from somewhere. It's hard to really be sure about that.
Okay. I guess someone asked if there's any connections with the Bahamas for people citing conky or great inagua, or even Cuba or Mexico. Is there a centralized band reporting vector?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. I think we would know pretty quick if someone cited conky outside of Florida. We communicate, for example, every time one of the Mexican birds shows up in Florida, we talk with the Mexican biologists who do the banding. We're in touch with people in the Bahamas. Right now, there's not banding happening in Cuba, and I'm not sure how good the kind of monitoring is there. But yeah, there's reports of banded flamingos kind of all across the Caribbean.
Okay, so everybody does communicate. All right, so this is one. Audubon's painting of the flamingo was a much bolder, darker pink color than the current flamingo coloring. Since flamingo color is from the diet, can you comment if the diet was changed or explain the color difference? And was Audubon accurate in painting its colors at the time?
It's a great question. I would expect there's been some diet shift kind of across the board, just because humans have impacted the Caribbean environment so extensively, particularly Florida Bay. We know that humans have really disrupted the whole Everglades ecosystem. And I would imagine that, for the flamingos in Florida, their diet is different from, what it was historically. One of the big questions we have is whether there's enough food to support flamingos in Florida Bay now. Audubon may have taken some kind of liberties with his illustration. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't have
the technology for Audubon's time, it's not like he could take a photo and paint from that. What Audubon did was painted from, recently alive birds, and he posed them on wire boards. And I think the one he painted was actually shot in Cuba, as I understand it. I know he witnessed, I know he saw birds in Florida, flamingos in Florida, but I'm not sure if the one that he painted, I remember reading something about it being shot in Cuba, and he saw it it was preserved in a whiskey barrel, but I don't know how that affects color.
I think you're right. I think I remember him writing that he was disappointed that he wasn't able to shoot them in Florida, but had someone send him specimens from Cuba.
Right. And someone asks, do they eat mostly the same thing that spoonbills eat?
I think spoonbills primarily eat small fish.
They do. Spoonbills are very specific on what they eat. And Jerry Lorenz is actually the guy who knows more about this than I think either of us. But yeah, they actually eat a very specific type of small fish. And I think it's probably about 6 inches of water. I think it's a very particular water depth that they feed into, but it is somewhat different. And Christina Wilson, who found the 6 flamingos on Big Torch this summer, asked, so why are flamingos showing up now? Does it have anything to do with the pandemic or the lack of humans down in the Keys? Because we had the 6 this summer, and then one that hung around for probably close to a month out there. And then around New Year's, we had one off of Sugarloaf for at least 2 weeks.
So let me show you this, because what we're seeing is definitely a trend. This is some information we put together a few years ago, which is reports of flamingos in Florida going back to the 1950s. And this is all based on information from bird watchers reported from different platforms, from eBird, which we're all familiar with, and from kind of its older analog, where people would write into Audubon and say, I saw these rare birds. And what we see, we have a number of different metrics for how many flamingos were observed. This is the number of observations, the number of individual reports of flamingos. This is the total number of flamingos seen, and this is the largest group size. And what we see over this window is whatever metric we use, there's more and more flamingos. And to me, what this says is that flamingos are starting to recover around the Caribbean. We have good information from the Bahamas that flamingos are recovering there. The Mexican population is recovering fairly well. And so I think what this means is that as those populations recover, more flamingos are trying to come back to Florida. And it would be great if we would help them a little bit and kind of help them reestablish here.
I'm all for that.
So I think what people are seeing is a definitive trend.
Okay, and see, we got a question. So if you know this, how much does a flamingo weigh, and how many are at Zoo Miami?
I wish I knew how much a flamingo weighed.
Okay.
I would have to look it up. I think we've got about 30 flamingos at Zoo Miami. Our flock has been growing. We moved our flamingos to a new exhibit about 4 years ago, and it takes them a little while to get used to a new area. But they started nesting 2 years ago for the first time. And last year we were able to get quite a few chicks, maybe 5 or 6 chicks out of our flock. So our flock is small but growing.
Okay. And actually, I just looked it up, and a flamingo weighs between 4.5 and 9 pounds, which is pretty solid for a bird. That's, I mean, it's, granted, it's a very tall bird, but that's a good bit of heft. So we have a couple more questions. That's someone making fun of the gray streak in my hair. And someone was asking, where can you see flamingos in the Keys? And that's it basically, it's not where, it's kind of how, and that's by being really lucky and paying attention. We'll always post it on the Audubon Facebook page if we see them around. We did have that one that showed up on New Year's Day, and it was around for, I think the last sighting was on the 14th. But probably the most reliable spot is snakebite in Everglades National Park. Though if you do that, remember to bring bug spray. It is an education in what Florida must have been like back in the day, because the mosquitoes can be insane. But once you get out there, there's a little bit of wind. It's not so bad, and you do have a chance of seeing a flamingo. So that's probably your most likely spot. Do you have any other secret spots you want to share, or?
I think what I do, because we're still looking for flamingos to try to capture and equip with more satellite transmitters. eBird has a rare bird report for Florida, and that includes flamingos. So one of the first things I do each morning is check through that rare bird report to see if there's any flamingos around. Because if there are, I may have to drop everything and go try to catch flamingos for a few days.
Okay. Well, so if you happen to see a flamingo, just let us know at Audubon. We'll get the information to Stephen. Stephen can drop whatever he's doing, and maybe we can get another satellite transmitter on it and figure out what they're doing in their secret lives. So, okay, I think we're at an hour. I just wanted to say, hey, thanks a lot, Stephen. It's been a great talk as always. We're recording this, assuming it works and the technology works. We're going to post it on YouTube later on, and we'll let you know if that happens. But thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Have a good night, and we will see you later.
Thank you all.
All right, thanks, Stephen.